Resident Evil 7 is a great horror game. It's both a reimagining of the franchise and a reboot of what made the early games so successful in the first place. With game budgets ballooning in the late 2000s, horror developers found themselves in a difficult position. They had to make their niche genre more mainstream. That meant tighter controls and horror that wasn't so uncomfortable people would be afraid to even buy their game. These horror titles had to become action games with horror elements. Resident Evil 4 demonstrated the success of that formula, and as it released on more platforms, it became one of Capcom's most successful titles ever. Resident Evil 5 performed even better. It dialed down the horror even further by emphasizing co-op and setting the game in broad daylight. Resident Evil 6 performed surprisingly well, considering its poor critical reception. It didn't meet Capcom's lofty expectations, but surely you'd be foolish to put those numbers at risk to make something different. The time was right for Capcom to make a change with this franchise, but it was risky to make a Resident Evil that looked more like this than this. Each successive entry in the franchise had become more action-focused, and with the exception of REs 3 and 6, sold better than every previous entry in the franchise. You think it was obvious business sense to buck that correlation? But while the horror genre seems to have done a pretty good job of dying off in the AAA space, it's faced a resurgence thanks to the independent scene. Small, independent titles don't need to sell 8 million copies to break even, they don't need to peel off the orange rind for mass appeal, and they don't need to spread out enough content to justify a $60 price tag. When Amnesia came out in 2010, it started a revolution by recognizing the only thing more terrifying than being trapped in a spooky mansion with limited ammo was being trapped in a spooky mansion without a weapon of any kind. Instead of managing your firepower, Amnesia had you managing your own sanity, spending precious tinderboxes in place of bullets to ward off the darkness. You're still running around environments performing what are pretty much just keycard hunts, but you don't much have the luxury of studying monster patrols and slipping through their ranks. So much as looking at them hurts your sanity, and thus costs you precious tinderboxes that you'll have to light in other places that you might not have wanted to. Guns might be gone, but the resource management and map navigation are still a part of the formula. If you are spotted, your only choice is to run and hide. It's disempowering, but can be just as tense as a challenging boss fight. After this is when you start to see games like Slender, which also penalized the player just for looking at its creature. These games are all about the sensitivity of your flight response and keeping cool under pressure. With Outlast, the mechanics were stripped down even further. Sanity meter? Who needs it? The only items that you needed to manage were the batteries for your night vision camera. The production values were a huge step up, and there was a bit more care put into justifying your trips around the asylum. Subtle details in the environment were enough to make players see threats where there were none. Outlast set the new standard, but it only continued the trend of removing gameplay elements while upping the production values. And then, PT appeared on the PlayStation Store. There was no announcement, and the developer had no previous record. Just as Amnesia had showed that, when it came to mechanics, less is more, PT did the same with level design. Every time that you turn this corner is terrifying. Your field of view is tiny, and you have this constant feeling that something is behind you. Unlike these other games, or unlike games in general, the rules here were obfuscated. You didn't know which actions would trigger the game to respond, forcing you to experiment. Among these is a blue X painted on a framed photo, calling on the player to gouge it out. In order to proceed, you have to remove yourself from the world of the game and recognize that that blue X is also a button on your controller. That is in pretty stark contrast to Amnesia, which opened by advising you to ignore its gamey elements. Instead of grounding its hallway setting, PT revels in its abstraction, and it reminds you of its very nature in the process. It's fine if the game breaks the fourth wall, as long as that immersion is maintained while you're in the real world. But that was merely a playable teaser for a Silent Hill game that we're never gonna see.
Don't touch that dial now, we're just getting started.
PT went on to inspire Layers of Fear and the likely never-to-be-released Allison Road, both of which forgo any sort of mechanical depth in favor of an atmosphere that you can taste. But it's Resident Evil 7 that recognizes the gamey elements that modern horror releases moved away from don't need to pull you out of the experience. When walking through this abandoned house, opening fridges and microwaves hungry for grub, it's pretty reminiscent of these more recent horror titles. There isn't any abstraction here. This place could be real, and the only actions that you can perform in the game are also actions that you can perform in real life. And then you start picking up weapons and you've got inventory management and a trailer to upgrade your stats. At first, RE7 looks like a souped up indie horror release, but the further that you play, the more it feels like classic Resident Evil. Of all things, it feels more like a video game. So much of modern horror is about getting you to forget that and to immerse yourself into the environment. The settings are supposed to draw you in close so that they can frighten you as if they were real. But atmosphere isn't the only way to draw a player in. In Outlast, I can close my eyes and the world really does go away. I can press the start button and everything grinds to a halt. Most players won't handicap themselves because playing like that just isn't fun. But the safety net is there if you should ever decide to use it. We know that none of this is real. Your goal is to die as little as possible, and the only real threat of that happening comes from hastily making a bad decision instead of keeping your cool under pressure. That's true in Slender, that's true in Amnesia, that's true in Outlast. Heck, if the game gets too scary and you want to take a minute to think, just hit the pause button. Games are abstract. They're moving images on a screen. They're pixels rendered by a program written by a team of designers that want to use them to scare you. You know it, and Kojima knows it. That's why the action in the game that you need to proceed is telegraphed as the button on your controller. That's why the Ghost in PT can haunt you in the pause menu.
That is fucking amazing.
Resident Evil 7 gives you puzzles like this. Find the 3 A's and a handprint to get a key. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The Baker family wouldn't set this up, and what is the key even for? Why is it here? But regardless, you dig in. You find the proper name, you find the handprint, and as you anticipate your reward for solving this puzzle, you get a spook. And I think that this is one of the most effective scares in the game because of how it catches you off guard. I also love this bit with the lockbox. The world is paused while spinning items around looking for something useful. But when you open up this item, hey, it's more of that grub from earlier. And let's compare those two scenes. In this one, I'm exploring an environment, trying to get a sense of the surroundings. But here, I'm looking for items, hoping that I'm going to find something tangible. One is building atmosphere through immersion, and the other is a subversion of the rules that the game has set for itself. Horror can be effective when you're immersed in the world, or engaged with the game. And I don't think that there's very many modern examples of the latter. The layout of this house doesn't make any sense. Why do keys open up some doors but not others? Why are they marked with crows and snakes? Because those things don't need to make sense for the world. They just need to make sense for the game. They may make the overall experience less atmospheric, but the scares are no less horrifying. And this extends into the combat too. In reality, having a gun would make a haunted house feel a whole lot safer. If you don't need it, great. But if you do, it's definitely a nice to have. But a game doesn't follow that logic. In games, every weapon comes from Mr. Chekhov himself, and you can be certain that it will be fired. Games expect you to use the supplies that you pick up, which means that every shot that you miss or item that you waste could have been used for something else. In action games, this level of maintenance usually isn't necessary. The only reason ammo exists in these games is to get you to change up your weapons from time to time. In the early hours of Resident Evil 7, I was always guessing whether or not I would have the supplies to survive my next encounter. And if I missed my shots earlier, it would be my fault if I didn't. As for the level design, Resident Evil 7 uses a small map. Richly detailed, sure, but I honestly cannot think of a full-priced game that has so few square feet for you to walk around in. It's a claustrophobic experience that has you backtracking through these densely packed rooms and consequently learning its maze-like hallways. Despite the repeat visits, this coat rack always looks like a threat, and the movement of this fan made me feel uneasy pretty much every time I had to visit this room. These environments may become familiar, but they never feel safe, and Resident Evil 7 is designed around that feature. Over the course of your playtime, you pick up 4 tapes that allow you to explore areas as recorded by characters that are not the protagonist. That means your inventory isn't carried over, and resources aren't available for you to spend. For these segments, Chekhov's armory is locked behind a huge safe, and you're clearly shown the key. The threat exists on your television alone, and while they're effective segments in their own right, their purpose is to show you an environment before expecting you to survive in it. They build anticipation for what's to come. Going through these areas the first time might be tense, but it's going back the other way when you know that the gloves are off. Horror in the past decade has largely been helmed by small teams with small budgets, racing toward mechanical minimalism, and the highest production values that they could achieve within those constraints. Their objective was simple. With the graphical fidelity provided by more powerful consoles, they could immerse players so deeply in a horror experience that they would forget they were even playing a game. Meanwhile, the AAA industry turned its back on the genre that scared away the consumers they needed to fund their larger budgets, and translated their horror IPs to more mainstream action flair, aiming to replicate the success of Resident Evil 4. Just as new technology was making it possible to do more with the genre, those interested parties decided first to do more with less, or less with more. So, when Resident Evil 7 leans into the keycard hunts, the shooting, and the inventory management from the earliest entries in its own franchise, and takes the lessons learned from the atmospheric horror success stories of the past few years, I can't help but feel that the promise of a Koji Pro-developed Silent Hill game has been fulfilled by Capcom, of all publishers. And while RE7 achieved both critical and commercial acclaim, plus some viral YouTube celebrity freakouts, it's raked in half as many sales as Resident Evil 6 did. Resident Evil 7 may not be the best horror title ever created, but it's probably my favorite. It's a niche genre where success has a ceiling, and I have to recognize Capcom for taking this risk, as well as each studio that attempted to do something different with the genre. This was the horror game that I didn't know that I wanted. Thanks for watching.